I've been asked to tell the story about the time that I ran away from home. Uh, I must have had from an early age a notion of the romance of the open road. I've already told the story about the summer of 1965 when I was hitchhiking across the United States. But if you want to go back even further in my life to when I was about 9 years old, and I had determined one day that I was going to leave home. I was going to go out and survive on my own. When I shared this plan with my brother Dennis, he decided that, well, he'd like to go along with me when we ran away from home. So I made all the necessary preparations. This is in the days before knapsacks, so I'm not really sure now exactly what we were carrying all of our gear in. I do remember we had some empty plastic bottles and we filled those up with water so that we would have water that we could drink while we were on the road. I wasn't doing this totally haphazardly because I realized that we'd have to have some money to live on while we were out and about. And I had decided that pop bottles would probably do it. Back in those days of glass pop bottles, you could get 2 cents for a small Coke bottle, a nickel for a large family-sized bottle. And for years I'd been finding these alongside the road and turning them in at the grocery store. So I figured that that would probably do it as far as money, while we were on the road. So I did this in a very very logical, rational way. I went next door where my mother was visiting a neighbor lady, and the neighbor lady came to the door, and I asked her to tell my mother that Dennis and I were leaving home, and then we went back, got our stuff together, and we hit the road. Now, we decided that it might not be a bad idea to drop by and see my grandparents before we really, got outside of Portland. So my grandparents lived about, I would say a couple miles away from where we were living at the time. So we stopped by their place and informed them that, yes, we were running away from home. I think they took us a little bit more seriously. And at that moment, it just so happened that my mother's brother, my Uncle Bud, who owned a small farm, he just happened coincidentally to be visiting my grandparents. And he had a pickup truck that was full of old bread, donuts, cinnamon rolls, stuff like that he had picked up from a bakery. And this was going to be feed for his pigs. And so he heard the story that we were getting ready to run away from home, and he thought, well, maybe my mother should have taken this a little bit more seriously. So he had Dennis get into the back of the pickup truck, and I got in there as well, and he drove us back home. Well, this was one of the most exciting events of my life because it was just absolutely amazing to be in the midst of just all kinds of yummy, edible stuff. And my brother and I were hoeing into buns and rolls and donuts and all this sort of stuff as my uncle was driving us back home. And when we arrived home, my mother, who had finally returned from the neighbor lady's house and had talked to my sister, and my sister had said, well, they told you, they were running away from home, and my mother hadn't believed it. So we came rolling into the yard, and my mother was just apoplectic. And she told us to get inside, and she was putting us to bed without any dinner. And my brother and I just laughed because we'd already had all the food we could possibly want, better than anything she could have made for dinner. I still look back on that incident as being somewhat like the pictures I remember from the comic books of Donald Duck. And Donald Duck had an uncle, you may recall, named Uncle Scrooge, who was just very, very rich, and he had tons and tons and tons of money. And he would go into a room that just had money piled everywhere. And whenever I think of being in that pickup truck with all that food piled around us. It was just like Uncle Scrooge being in the midst of all of his money. That's the only time I ever thought about running away from home. But later on, again, as I told you before, I hit the road on one other occasion.